The standard viewing experience for a movie is to simply think of it in terms of a series of plot points. Each scene has a sort of headline statement that it's making. Oh, in this scene the character goes to meet that character and they have a conflict. And then the next scene, one of them goes off and tells somebody else what happened. And then the next scene, that character goes and has a conflict with them. And, you can sort of think of movies as being a series of summary headlines for individual scenes. That's like a very simple, basic way of experiencing a movie. And I think most of us experience movies kind of on that level. Most of this is done through straightforward dialogue. Characters tell us what's going on, what happened, what's going to happen. They frequently tell us what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And it leaves us with very little work to do as an audience. We just sit back and get told what's what, as if we're looking at a series of news headlines. Slightly better movies will take an approach of trying to show us what's going on instead of having characters state it all the time. And, some movies do this really well. But still, it's simply a case of straight observation. Oh, this happened. This character just did this. This character went there and did that, and so on. This is the very basic, simple interpretation of movies that most of us have on a casual viewing level, and that's all fine. But it's very, very clear through all kinds of different means that a lot of movies have a hell of a lot more going on than what is stated in dialogue and what is overtly shown in the most obvious behaviour. Frequently we have admissions by the filmmakers themselves. You can go and watch a DVD commentary and the director or the writer or some producers or maybe even some actors can tell you lots of things about what's going on in the movie and about what certain things mean. Sometimes the filmmakers will tell you that a certain location looks a certain way in order to establish a certain point. They might state that a character is wearing certain types of clothes because it communicates something specific that is never said in dialogue. But you would probably not realise that the costume meant anything unless the filmmaker told you in the DVD commentary. So we have filmmaker commentaries as evidence that movies are deeper than what they first appear. Maybe not all movies are deeper, but a lot of movies are, and a lot of movie releases have DVD commentaries to that effect. We also have the issue of propaganda movies, which we all know exist. This is hardly debated at all. I mean, there are whole books released on this subject. There are academic studies done on it. There are movies that have investment by governments, by military, in order to promote certain ideas to the public through a fiction format. So that's another way in which a lot of movies often have a deeper side that goes beyond the very obvious surface plot. Another issue we have is product placement. We all know that this exists. It's been talked about. It's been verified. You actually see the names of companies at the ends of movies when they've invested in a movie. You don't always get to see who's invested in it, but sometimes you do. And, at the end of, say, a James Bond movie, you might see Pepsi or Coca-Cola or British Airways or a bunch of other corporations whose names are on the credits at the end of the movie, and you'll often find, if you go through the movie, you will find examples of product placement where that particular brand appears in the movie. This is extremely common in movies. Now, whether that product placement is something that's actually worth exploring and whether it adds any value to the movie, of course that's debatable, but it is a proven and established example of how there is more going on in movies beyond the obvious surface plot. And of course we have academic interpretation and critique of movies, which comes in all kinds of formats. There have been thousands of books written by academics ever since movies first began. And in those books or in published papers, we get academics talking about their interpretations of classic movies. And there's a lot of stuff in there that is garbage. There's a lot of stuff in there that was really, really good. But, the very fact that our academic system includes film studies classes where they're not just talking about how to make a movie technically, they're talking about what the movies mean, they're talking about the significance of characters, the significance of set design and props and things like that. These things count for a lot. So we've got all of this evidence across the board that movies are not just about a basic plot structure where you just go through and it's, oh, this is happening, that's happening, oh, that just happened, and it gets to the end and all of the mysteries about the story are all tied up and it's like, oh, okay, now we understand what happened in this story, the end. and then we just walk away and there's nothing more to think about. I mean, you do get some movies that are presented in that kind of closed manner where you get to the end of the movie and the movie doesn't seem to give much left in terms of rewatch value, in terms of things that you can discover in a second or third viewing. But plenty of movies do that. And the fact that we watch movies more than once, well, not all of us do, and that's an important point. A lot of us will watch our favourite movies more than once because we know that there's something more about that movie and we want to explore it emotionally and intellectually. And so I think that's quite a distinctive point, actually. I'm going to make that right now. I was going to make it later on, but I have noticed when I've met people who tend not to see beyond the surface plot of a movie, that they're the type of people who don't really ever watch a movie more than once. They see a movie and then they just think, that's it, I understand it, and we're all done with it, and there's no reason to watch it again. And so this is an interesting thing. When you have people who have a single take on something, a single take on a movie, the types of people who only watch a movie once and don't want to explore it for anything deeper, I tend to get the impression that those are also the kinds of people who only want to read a book once and don't want to read back over it. They don't want to see a news article more than once and examine it again to see if there's anything that they missed. They're the type of people who like to just be presented with a straightforward narrative of whatever it is that they're exploring, and then just assume that they understand it straight off the bat and not have to go back and re-examine. Some people appear almost completely confused when you explain to them something about, say, in the Star Wars movies, the Empire basically represents the Nazis. Some people will respond to that and be like, hang on, what are you talking about? No, I've got the Star Wars narrative worked out in my head. It's a science fiction film. It's set in a galaxy far, far away. It's not about Earth. It's not about people. It's not about human history. Some people, you tell them that and they go, oh my God, and they don't want to deal with it. And other people are like, wow, I never thought of that. And then they think back over the movie and they're like, wow, that actually makes sense. And they enjoy the movie more. But it's so weird that some people have this response of avoidance, even anger. Some people get quite annoyed if you tell them that a movie has certain depths, certain hidden themes, and they realise that they've missed that in all the previous viewings if they've had more than one viewing. And some people actually get angry in response to it, which is quite bizarre. And so for a while I've been pretty interested in why people have this avoidance response, this denial of stepping beyond the surface plot of a movie. And I've also noticed that a lot of those people who don't want to look deeper are also not the kinds of people who would listen to a DVD commentary by the filmmakers. They don't want to know how the film was made. They don't want to explore it deeper. So if they don't want to watch the movie again, why would they even want to watch a filmmaker's commentary? It also shows in people's choice of movies as well. The types of people who don't want to look beyond the surface plot, I've noticed that they almost universally do not like the movies of David Lynch. They're not the type of people who would watch a Mulholland Drive or a Lost Highway, or especially they wouldn't want to watch a movie like Eraserhead, because those David Lynch movies don't provide a simple, easy, step-by-step, join-the-dots headline narrative that gets to the end and then you walk away feeling like you understand everything that's in the movie. David Lynch movies tend to leave a lot of questions at the end, a lot of unanswered plot points. It's like, oh, what happened there? Was this scene real? Was this scene a dream? The types of people who only want the surface narrative, they don't like movies by the likes of David Lynch. And I think that tends to be a big giveaway as well. They want the most basic surface narrative that they can get. When these people do watch a complex and difficult movie, often not by choice, because sometimes you watch a movie thinking you're getting a straightforward narrative and you end up watching something that's insanely bizarre. I find that a lot of these people, when the movie is finished, they'll just say, oh, that was weird, and then by using the word weird, it's like, let's dismiss it. But my attitude to weird is that weird is an opportunity to learn something. If I come across something that appears weird, I'm like, okay, that's weird. that's interesting. To me, weird and interesting are, pretty much intertwined. If something's weird, then I want to explore it. I want to understand it. I want to examine it. I want to learn more. Because when something is weird, it means that you subconsciously feel like there's something more going on, but you don't have a conscious explanation for it. And therefore you have something that you can learn. Weird is good for that reason. So yeah, that's a common one. It's weird. Let's walk away. Another form of denial, and this is a very easy one, which a lot of people engage in this, is to cherry pick common misinterpretations of movies and then flag wave them in order to dismiss all interpretations of movies. So, somebody will come out with sometimes it'll be a real example. For example, there was this film critic who claimed that this movie was about that and claimed that this detail in the movie meant this, and then the actual filmmaker came along and said, well, no, it doesn't mean that at all. And those people will flag wave an example like that as a way of indirectly saying, look, all film interpretation is garbage, and therefore we should only ever believe the surface plot of a movie. And that's quite ridiculous, really, because it's like saying, let's say Dr. Harold Shipman, the serial killer in Britain, he was a doctor, he functioned for years. I could easily point to Harold Shipman and say, he was a doctor and he was a serial killer and therefore you should not trust doctors. But that would be a stupid proposition. Anybody can cherry pick good or bad examples from a specific area of study and then flag wave them to either boost up or discredit a particular point of view on that issue. A more nuanced response that some people have is that they will acknowledge a certain theme about a movie, but it will be the most basic summary headline. They might say something like, The Matrix was a warning about the future dangers of technology. And they'll just summarise it with an extremely simple headline and then just, I've got the headline, therefore I understand the hidden themes. But actually, if you go and study the Matrix movie in detail, that whole hidden theme can be broken down into all kinds of detailed nuances. But when a person simply establishes it as a headline theme and then just uses that to dismiss the movie, that's another example of a sort of form of denial. It's a weird one, that, and it happens in all kinds of ways, but I've come across it a lot. In fact, one weird variation of it is sometimes people will say, everyone knows this. Everybody knows that Starship Troopers was a critique of the war on terror before it even actually happened. But no, they didn't. If you actually go back and look at the critical response to the movie Starship Troopers when it first came out, there was hardly any discussion of what the film was really about. And years later, people started to learn about it. I'm sure some people started figuring out on the first viewings, but most of us were just like, okay, that was just some dumb sci-fi action movie. And as the years went by, the movie became more and more known for its satirical take on foreign policy. Something else I've also noticed is that a lot of people who have a denial that movies have more things going on beyond the surface plot, those people who deny that also tend not to have any particular interests in psychology in general. They're not the type of people who discuss deep psychology. They're not the type of people who like to explore and discuss the potential meanings of dreams. And they're not the type of people who have any interest in the subject of hypnosis. Because hypnosis is quite an interesting one, which reveals a lot about human nature and just how bizarre the mind is. But yeah, those are three particular subjects that film depth deniers are also in denial of. So I think you're probably starting to get the point that there's people who lock themselves into the surface plot of a movie and don't want to see anything more than that. They tend to be single narrative people, people who only want a most basic, simple explanation that is immediately understandable, and they don't want to have to go back over it and think about it again. They just want to stick with their immediate understanding and say, that's it, I've got it, and I don't need to look again. And this crosses over into other aspects of their lives. I find that the people who do that also are not the type of people who tend to question, for example, the stories that they hear in newspapers. So it's not just about their attitude to movies, it's also about their attitude to general life narratives presented in all kinds of different contexts. And because of this, I tend to find that those kinds of people also tend to be disinterested in understanding a wide range of human behaviours and human beliefs and human attitudes. These are the kinds of people who believe that their cultural place, their position in a certain perception of the world as is shared with them by the average person around them, they tend to think that that reality is reality, and that other people in different parts of the world or throughout history who've held very different views of reality, all those rest of those people are wrong, and we in the present have got it right. The consensus opinion of the average person who is just following a simple surface in the moment narrative that doesn't require any thought, that is reality. That tends to be the attitude. And I think that gets into some of the core reasons. I think there's core hidden reasons behind this, why some people don't want to see beyond the plot of a movie. And that is a core one of them, not wanting to question what is commonly believed. The average person perceives One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest as just being a comedy set in a mental health hospital, and it's the commonly held belief, it's the easy belief, and some people don't want to step outside of the commonly held belief. They find that uncomfortable because they think if they suddenly start to perceive something more in depth than the average person does, then it somehow means that they're going crazy, or that they're weird, or that they're going to lose social credibility because they don't think like everybody else. It's very sad, but a lot of people have this kind of attitude, and it really prevents them from expanding their minds on all kinds of issues. And to that effect, I consider that denial of there being anything beyond the surface plot in a movie isn't an intellectual limitation. It's an emotional choice. I find that the IQ level of a film viewer has nothing to do with their attitude to try and see something beyond the surface narrative, if there is anything there. It's an emotional choice. And this happens for a variety of reasons. I'm going to try and break that down now. One that I already mentioned earlier is the fear of stepping out of the consensus view of something. Not wanting to perceive a movie in a way that other people don't perceive it, in case it reflects badly on the viewer as being, oh, you're a weirdo because you think this movie's about this when the rest of us think it's about something else. Never ever simply follow the sheep just for the sake of following the sheep, because the herd very, very often get things wrong. But a lot of people have this attitude that if you step out of the herd mentality, then there's something wrong with you. No, often it's the other way around. Often it means that there's something right with you. But yeah, that's one of the major reasons. But another one is fear of intellectual complexity. A lot of people, even though they are technically intelligent, they're very articulate, they're very capable of memorizing complex verbal arguments that have already been described by others. A lot of those people, they're able to pass off themselves as intellectual, but they actually don't like thinking in complex ways if you really break it down. And one example, a classic example of how this occurs, is what's known as the perceptual principle of Occam's razor. Okay, this Occam's razor one, I've heard this quoted so many times. If we use Occam's razor, then blah, 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 blah. Now, Occam's razor is the idea that if you have more than one explanation for a particular event, then the simplest explanation that fits with the evidence is the one that is true. And there's actually no precedent for that at all. There's no reason to believe that a simple explanation and a complex explanation, each of which fit with the evidence, there's no reason to believe that the simple one is the one that is by default true. In fact, I would say it's likely the other way around. That's right, yeah, I'm going to blow apart Occam's razor here. And here's why the complex explanation is the more likely truthful one. When somebody gives an extremely simplistic interpretation of something, a very simplistic description, that description is less likely to run into counter evidence because by its simplistic nature it takes less evidence into account, whereas a complex explanation of something tends to touch upon more pieces of evidence and therefore is more likely to run into counter evidence, right? And so therefore, because the complex explanation is rising to the challenge of linking itself to more pieces of evidence, if that complex explanation does not encounter counter evidence, then in my view, that would be the more likely true explanation. So there you go, that's the Occam's razor delusion. It's terrible. I've heard it quoted so many times, and there is absolutely no precedent for it. I mean, if you go and look at the physical sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, each of those scientists has, over the past couple of centuries, revealed a level of new complexity to physical reality that we had no idea was there before, right? So as we study science more and more, we study the physical world and its structure in more and more detail, we find out that it's actually way more complex than anybody in history ever anticipated. And that doesn't sit well with Occam's razor, does it? So I tend to take the attitude these days that reality is always far more complex than the descriptions that we have for it. And therefore, if you've got a complex description that doesn't meet counter evidence, then that one is more credible. But on a more basic level, I think the reason a lot of people avoid complexity is because it's a bit of a headache. People want to have the simplistic A plus B equals C, very straightforward narrative. You just learn it once, you memorize the catchphrase, and then you've got it and you don't have to think about it ever again. People want that because it's easy, yeah? And whereas if you have to try and figure something out, if you have to take lots of things into account and come up with your own understanding, your own verbal explanation for it without somebody else spoon feeding it to you with a news headline, that's more of a headache. And a lot of people really don't like doing that. It's almost like a laziness. Some people, they don't want to get on the treadmill and do any exercise and lose the fat. And, it's just like that, but it's the mental version of it. Also related to that is the issue that some people really don't want to break out of a verbal understanding of reality. When we watch movies, it's not just about dialogue. It's not just about what's written in the script. You've got all kinds of visual stuff going on in the movie. You've got camera angles. You've got editing choices. You've got set designs, you've got props, you've got costumes. There's an absolute mountain of sensory information going on in movies, both in terms of sound effects, in music, and in visuals. There's so much information going on there, and a hell of a lot of it goes beyond the plot of the movie. But a lot of people like to completely ignore that and just go with the verbal explanation. It's almost as if they would prefer to just have the script and read the script and go, okay, well, I understand it now. And everything else that falls outside of verbal description is null and void. A lot of people are like that. A lot of people believe that reality is basically something that can be summarized in simple words. Whereas we all have a sensory experience of the world. We all see, we all feel, smell, taste, and we all have this constant bombardment of sensory information in the world. And yet a lot of us, because of the way we've been raised with language, we learn how to limit our experience, our perception, by coding everything in simple words. And it gets even worse than that because most situations in life, there isn't a single verbal description that aptly captures the reality. Most situations, you can come up with multiple verbal descriptions, and each one of those verbal descriptions will have its merits and will have a certain amount of truth to it. And so the more ways that you can find to describe one situation, if you have 3 or 4 descriptions of one situation, then you have a better understanding than the person who only has one verbal description of that situation. Let's take, for example, the most basic verbal summary of reality that often gets quoted. The world is round. People talk about reality and they tell other people, they want to say to other people, look, let's just stick with reality. The world is round. We hear this phrase a lot. But if you actually go and research it and read about it in details, especially from academic sources, you find out that apparently the Earth isn't perfectly round. Apparently the North and South poles are very slightly squashed so that the Earth is a I think they call it an elliptoid shape, a very slight elliptoid shape, instead of being a perfect sphere. So that phrase, the world is round, that's one way of describing it, but you can also describe it as an elliptoid, and that would have as much merit. And also, if you study the Earth's surface in detail, and we all know this from our daily life experience, there are hills, there are mountains, the oceans have deep crevices in them, and the waves of the oceans, the flattest part of the Earth is probably the oceans, and even that has waves that go up and down. So you can argue that the world isn't perfectly round. So just the most basic statements of reality, usually you can find other descriptions that hold more merit, and they hold more merit because they are more complex and take more information into account. So yeah, we have like a combination, the fear of complexity, which also ties in with the fear of multiple interpretations. A lot of people only want to have a single interpretation of any given situation because it's easy. As soon as you introduce more than one interpretation, you say, well, each of these interpretations is valid. A lot of people get confused. It's almost like their reality is crumbling. And they're just like, give me the narrative that is actually true. And it's like, well, they're both true. Here's another one that's true. And the last example I'm going to give, I think this is quite a common one. I don't think it's always the case, but I definitely think this definitely plays its role in the denial of movies having anything going on beyond the surface plot. And that is the fear of the subconscious. This ties in with several of the things I've already talked about. When I've said that the kinds of people who only want to have the straight up surface narrative on the first viewing, and they don't want to entertain the idea that they might have missed something or that there might be something deeper, I think that ties in with the fear of the subconscious. Some people really don't want to know what is going on deep down within themselves. They don't want to know about the deeper symbolism that occurs within their own dreams. They don't want to know about movies that show you one thing in terms of the surface narrative, and then later on it turns out that that was an illusion, because that sort of casts doubt on the viewer's reality, and it sort of says to the viewer, well, listen, your instinctive perception of what is actually true, it's a little bit flawed, and sometimes you have to actually stop and go back and question your view on things, and find out that something else was true. That makes some people really uncomfortable, because it's almost like they have to admit to themselves that their own automatic instinctive perception of reality is not good enough, and that they actually need to think deeper, and they don't want to do that. And also, especially deep in the subconscious, especially with horror movies tend to tap into our subconscious fears, and a lot of people just like to take the attitude that, it's just a horror movie, it's just a scary horror movie, the whole point of it is to just make us feel scared for an hour and a half. But no, the reason that horror movies play on that, and it virtually always is the case, that a really good horror movie typically plays on subconscious fears of the audience, and often brings up things that the audience feel uncomfortable with. A lot of great movies do this, but some people don't want to explore their own subconscious. They don't want to explore the subconscious of other people either. So for example, if they see a movie that's about somebody who is evil, who does evil things, they just want to go, that person's evil and that's it. This is the good guy, that's the bad guy, and that's it. They don't want to explore the idea that there might be subconscious things going on that mean that the bad guy actually isn't quite totally a bad guy, but there's reasons for the way they act that they do. And the good guy isn't perfectly good because there's dark things going on with inside him. And this is true with all of us. All of us have good and bad things going on within us, and some people don't want to entertain that. They want life to be separated out into, here's the good guys, and I'm one of them, and there's the bad guys over there, and they are terrible, and let's just shout them down. A lot of people love that attitude to life, but it is absolutely wrong. It's not the case. The evil is present in all of us. We all have dark edges deep down in our subconscious, and this is evident in the dreams that we have. I would say pretty much all of us have had violent dreams at some point in our life where we've committed acts of violence. I would say pretty much all of us at some point in our life have had sexual dreams where we wake up and we think, oh my God, Where did that come from? And we've done something sexual in a dream that we would never think about doing consciously in a waking state. And so dreams bring all this kind of stuff up, all this discomfort, all of these subconscious urges, fears, desires that always exist for us, but we pretend that they're not there, or we don't have access to them consciously. And so that kind of stuff manifests in our dreams, but it also manifests in the movies that we watch as well. People watch horror movies because horror movies help them to deal with the darkness that is present in themselves and in the world in general. And horror movies help people deal with that through a symbolic, metaphoric format. And I think a lot of people instinctively know that movies have this effect. I mean, when you think about it, you're watching a movie, you know that the actors are just actors. You know that what you're seeing on the screen isn't real. You know that it's just special effects. You know that there's fake sets. You know that it's all been edited in a way that mismatches the way we experience daily life. And yet we still engage in watching movies even though we know that they are fake from the first frame to the last. Why do we do that? Because those movies hold symbolic relevance for us. And we tend to watch the movies which convey the kinds of themes that we relate to in real life. So you tend to get more men who watch action movies because men are more orientated towards violence. We're physically, genetically, we're more inclined towards violence, and culturally men are raised to have an attitude of, well, you've got to be able to physically fight to survive. You have to be able to physically fight off other men and defend yourself. And therefore, action movies, well, what we call action movies, which are basically violent fantasy movies, those movies hold more appeal to men because they are raised to believe that their own existence is more dependent upon issues of violence and defense. And then you get the same thing everywhere else. You know, whatever the subjects are that people are most concerned about in their own personal existence, that shapes which kinds of movies they choose to watch. And so that, across the board, is a strong piece of evidence that shows that movies mean a hell of a lot more to people than simply, here's 2 hours of escaping into some fantasy. But even the word fantasy, why would it be a fantasy? Fantasy is there because it taps into our subconscious fears and desires. Okay, so there you go. You know, movies are way deeper than a lot of people give them credit. A lot of movies can be watched more than once, and deeper things can be learned from them. But yeah, still, some people have this attitude that movies only have a surface narrative plot and there's nothing deeper than that. And as soon as somebody starts talking about it being deeper, they get upset and they want to avoid it, or they want to argue and fight. So yeah, there you go. That's my thoughts on what I call the blind viewer. Why some people are in denial of the fact that there is deeper stuff going on in movies beyond the obvious surface plot. I hope you enjoyed this. You've been listening to Rob Ager of collativeLearning.com. I have a Patreon page where you can access more content. Head over to the website. You'll find all kinds of articles and videos on filmmaking and psychology, mainly filmmaking. And you can also order some downloads there, but I've also got 3 channels here on YouTube where you can access all kinds of content as well. Okay, see you later, folks. Bye-bye.